Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation, an agency of the federal government established by Congress to improve teaching about the United States Constitution.
Well, you mentioned how Madison began with deep skepticism about partisanship and parties, and later on kind of had a change of heart and embraced them, at least his own party, which he helped to create. But I'm reminded that he does say in Federalist 10 that the latent causes of faction, he says, are thus sown in the nature of man. He said people will always have differences, political differences, and in a regime of liberty, you cannot stamp that out. You can't get rid of those differences. So my question would be, in the telling, and it's a very fetching telling you give of this brawling birth of partisanship, are we doomed to partisanship? If Madison is right about the causes of party and faction.
I won't use the word doomed. I will say, though, that it is in the nature of politics that people who have different ideas, and in a free society, people do have different ideas. They have different interests. They have every right, and therefore they will group together in furtherance of their views. Because politics, legislative politics to begin with, always comes down to eventually a yes or no. You vote for this bill or against this bill. There is a tendency for two parties to emerge, especially when you have just, if you need 51% of the vote to win, for your side to win. So the nature of these groupings might change over time, and sometimes they will be interest-driven, sometimes they will be personality-driven. So the idea that people like Benjamin Franklin had, that civic virtue is something we really need. The republic will rise or fall on whether people can put the interests of the nation, the interests of the group, ahead of the interests of the individual. Madison fairly quickly gave up on, if only because he realized, well, that's not happening. And if we say that a republic can't survive without civic virtue, well, we're not seeing a lot of civic virtue, so that means the republic is doomed. No, he wasn't willing to say that. So one of the things he talks about, of course, in Federalist 10 is how we can diminish the effect of faction. And if we can play one faction off against another, and it's part of the justification for going big with the Union. And that way, no faction is going to be big enough to take over the whole country. So he realizes in Federalist 10, he's in a position where he says explicitly, yeah, differences of opinion will exist. So the question is, how can we prevent them from breaking the country apart, breaking the Union apart? And one way is if we can make sure that other factions are allowed to emerge, and so they will neutralize each other, they balance each other out.
Extend the sphere, I think.
Precisely. And so he's talking then, and in Federalist 10, he makes the bold case, and it was really counterintuitive for people of his age, that an extensive republic would be more stable than a small republic. The republics before this had been essentially city-states, where you knew other people, and so you could count on that knowledge and that feeling of, okay, I know you, I know your family and all this, and so I'm willing to set aside my interests and this civic virtue can blossom. But what do you do with people if you're in the Carolinas and the people in New England are doing something you don't like? Okay, you can't count on that personal knowledge in an extensive republic, but you can count on, said Madison, the southern states, they will have their interests that'll counterbalance the interests of New England, and then things will balance out. And so it's going to be impossible for any faction to take over the whole country. I mean, that was basically the gist of it. Now, when I read that from Madison, Madison was a clever thinker. He was a good political rhetorician and writer in the sense that he knew how to make a good case for his side. And I never have completely convinced myself that he was convinced by this argument. It was an argument that made the case for the Constitution. Did he really believe that this was going to happen? I don't know. Well, it turned out that it didn't quite work out that way. And the factions, and also, I don't think he thought that the factions were going to be permanent and that they were going to be, well, they would create these blocks that began, they would create political parties. When he wrote it, he wasn't thinking of these parties that would eventually be institutions unto themselves, where somebody would be a Republican first or a Federalist first, and then a member of Congress, and then a senator from Virginia or whatever it might be. And that's the way it eventually turned out. But Madison gradually concludes that, okay, factions are with us, so we better make the best of them. And so Madison eventually, following the lead of Jefferson, becomes an enthusiastic partisan. And it's, in some ways, there's this sense of innocence lost. Okay, because they had this dream, they had this Republican dream, and the dream crashed into reality. Now, I will mention this, that in the long history of the United States, it has been a lot easier for Americans to think nationally, to think in a unified sense during wartime, because the enemy is out there. And if we don't band together, we will fall apart. Or as Benjamin Franklin said, if we don't hang together, we will hang separately. So their experience of Republican politics up until 1783 was in wartime. And so they thought, okay, maybe we've had 7 years of this virtuous stuff, maybe that will persist. But as soon as the war ended, then that civic spirit began to dissolve. And you get disruptions here, there, and everywhere. And so then they had to really settle down and say, so how does this work for the long haul? And what can we count on? And so in the case of Madison, I think he resigned himself to parties. Okay, and if we're going to have parties, then we ought to do them well. Jefferson, even through his presidency, hardly admitted that what he was doing was what he actually was doing. That he still liked it. He still spoke of his party as representing the will of the people. And there were these monocrats, which was a term he often used for the Federalists.
Which he coined, I believe.
Yeah. And so they're trying to hijack the public interest. So again, you hear this all the time, down to today. Our party represents the will of the people. Our party is the party of the heartland, the silent majority, whatever you want to call it. And it's those other people who are trying to frustrate the public interest. That's probably inevitable in party rhetoric. And I think it's probably inevitable in just human nature. We're really good at figuring out ways of explaining why the things we need to do for our own interests are actually the right thing to do and in the public interest.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.